Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Welcome in the Senate. And today the Senate is organizing the second lecture in a cycle of 4 lectures, which are all connected to our current art exhibition. And if for some obscure reason you didn't have the opportunity yet to visit our exhibition, I most certainly recommend you to do so after the lecture, not right now, after the lecture. And when you do so, downstairs there is a room and there is a cartoon. You can watch the cartoon. It's called Corporate Armies. It depicts large multinationals engaged in a real world war, fighting for nothing less than world domination. It's fiction, of course, don't worry. Multinationals just want to make profits. They do not intend to rule the world. Or do they? Today, among us, we have Mr. Franklin Foer from the United States, who may just shed another light on this issue. We are very honored that Mr. Foer crossed the entire Atlantic Ocean, all the way from the United States. The United States is that great country that enriched the world with a long list of great inventions, such as Edison's phonograph, the space shuttle, chocolate chip cookies, the impeachment of presidents, Diet Coke, dental floss, but also investigative journalism. The United States is the cradle of investigative journalism. And we have among us one of the brilliant investigative journalists of the United States, Franklin Foer, who writes for The Atlantic, which is probably one of the 10 best English language magazines in the world, who also publishes global bestsellers, very intelligent, brilliant books. And his last publication is The World Without Mind. It's about some other great American inventions that enriched the world, such as Amazon, Facebook, Google, and Apple. Are they threats to democracy, or are they opportunities for democracy? Mr. Foer, you have the floor.
Thank you. As much as I was like, I came into this room beforehand, and I wanted to speak from here because it felt like I would almost be fulfilling an adolescent fantasy to be at the center of a powerful place. But I feel like in the spirit of super democracy and also just to try to make it a little bit more informal, I would speak with a microphone. Thank you. And I had no idea that the United States had invented dental floss. So I've learned something important today. I wrote this book. It's about Google, Facebook, Apple, and Amazon. And I think everybody in the world has a sense of the role that these companies play in our everyday lives and the ways in which we have become just more deeply enmeshed in the systems that they create. So, hazard to guess, everybody in this room has a smartphone. And if you have a smartphone, you know that feeling when your phone is in another room and you feel like you're not a whole person, and you feel almost a physiological compulsion to rush to get your phone back because it's as if your arm has been cut off. And I shudder to think how many times a day I check my phone. I was just in Silicon Valley when I was promoting my book, and I met with a guy who had worked for Google and then quit working for Google because he claimed, and I'll tell you a little bit more about him in a bit, but he claimed that their systems were even more addictive than you imagine. And he described to me a phenomenon which he called the phantom buzz. I don't know if anybody in this room has ever experienced the phantom buzz. It's when you feel as if your phone is going off, and then you take it out of your pocket and you realize that nothing's happened, but you've been conditioned to expect to be notified. And really, in a way, this is not, what I'm describing is not terribly novel. We've experienced it before. So 50 years ago, we had the advent of television dinners, processed foods, and it seemed at the time that those were incredible conveniences. You didn't have to go to the store every day. You didn't have to clean up pots and pans after you cooked. But then we woke up many decades later and we said, holy cow, these foods were engineered to make us fat. They were engineered to addict us. They were loaded with sugar, salt, and fat in ways that changed our appetites. They changed our palates. And they also changed the way in which food was produced. It changed the whole economy of agriculture, where you had massive new concentrations of power. And so I am worried that the same thing that happened to our diets with food is happening to our intellectual diets. And in the same way in which we became physically obese, we stand to become mentally obese. Because these technologies, just like a bag of Doritos, have been reversed engineered to make us crave things that we didn't crave before. And so you see this with your smartphone, which it's notifying you constantly. There's a war that's happening to seize your attention. The most valuable thing that you have as a human being is your attention. And that's also the most valuable commodity that these companies intend to capture. And so they do everything they can to do it. And the best example to my mind is Facebook. So Facebook, as with all of these companies, collects data. What is data? Data is everywhere you've traveled on the web. It's everything that you've read, everything you've browsed, everything you've purchased. It is your friends. And it's essentially, it's a portrait of the inside of your head. And Facebook takes this data, this incredibly intimate portrait of you, and it uses you to keep you more engaged on its site. They use this history that you've supplied them with in order to try to addict you to their products. And so Facebook is it's a feedback loop. Facebook takes they take this history and then they try to guess what it is you want next. And so when it comes to politics, they have a very, very good portrait of your head. They know exactly the things that give you pleasure. They know exactly the things that cause you anxiety. And Facebook takes that and they use it to array information. Facebook is it's an incredibly powerful source of news and information for a very large section of our planet. And most people, when they use Facebook, just assume, oh, it's my friends sharing news and information with me. And they have no idea that there's a company that's making decisions about what's important and what's not important. And it has no idea that that company is making that decision, providing a hierarchy to news and information, not based on what's objectively important, but doing it in a way to try to, as I said, keep you engaged. And their view of engagement is another person's addiction. And I stumbled onto this problem initially as a journalist. I have my own fairly unique connection to Facebook, which is I worked at a magazine where I was in Washington, D.C., called The New Republic. It was a small, intellectually minded magazine based in Washington, and it was just 100 years old. And we had this very unusual combination of writing about politics in an insider sort of way. We had pieces about policy, and we had long essays about high culture, about art. And it was the type of magazine that you probably would never invent now, but is almost an accident of history. And so, this magazine existed. We had a hard time finding our way through the internet era, and we were always searching for new investors. And suddenly, in 2012, a guy called Chris Hughes walked into the magazine. Now, Chris had been Mark Zuckerberg's roommate at Harvard. And so he was a co-founder of Facebook. And I met him when he was 28 years old, and he was worth $700 million. Right, you hate him already. But he came to the New Republic, and he said, look, I am committed to serious journalism, and I have money to spend on this project, and I can help you survive the digital era because I invented social media. And it was an incredibly thrilling possibility. And we acted as if we carried the possibility of trying to find a dignified solution to all these problems that ailed the profession of journalism. And when we started, it was thrilling because we were trying to create new rules for journalism. When we started, we designed a website that was going to be an anti-website. I don't know if you know, when you look at a website, most websites you can scroll almost forever. There's an endless sampling of articles. But with our website, we decided we were going to try to create something that was actually more like a magazine, that had hierarchy and finitude, and it was very clear what was most important. And it was a really beautiful website that we created, except for the fact that it didn't work in the way that we hoped it would. We hoped that it would bring us a big new audience, and instead our audience didn't really grow. And so Chris said, look, we need revenue. And the way to get revenue is to get more readers on the internet, to get more traffic. And the way you get more traffic is that you create things that will flourish on Facebook. And again, lucky us, he invented Facebook. And so we changed the way that we started to do business. The New Republic had been a magazine that was committed to publishing original ideas. We were very, very contrarian, almost to a fault. We were contrarian. And so if a writer came to me and they said, here's my story idea, the thing that would not appeal to me is if it was conventional wisdom, if it was something that I felt like I'd heard before. And so what we started to do was almost the opposite of that. We had to suddenly start to figure out the mind of the Facebook user. And so there are ways to do this. And the primary way is data. That journalism has become obsessed with data. If you walk into the newsroom of the New York Times or the Washington Post, there are TV screens or they're big screens hovering over the newsroom. And they're like stock market tickers. And they show how popular an article is at any given moment. And they show how much traffic is going to that article from Google or Facebook. And on my phone, I had an application called Chartbeat. And Chartbeat was like on a car, an odometer that shows you how fast you're going, except what it's really showing you is how popular you are at any given moment, how popular an article is at any given moment. And so talking about addiction, this actually became an addiction for me. So I would wake up in the morning and I would look at Chartbeat and I would say, oh my God, we're not popular enough at right now. We need to do something to change it. And I started to get really anxious about how could we become how could our articles become more popular? And in part, I was doing this for business reasons, right? We needed more revenue. We needed to sell more ads. And so each additional person who clicks on a site is actually a couple more cents to the bottom line. But it's a really human impulse. If you're a human being, you want to win. And if you see what works, you want to repeat it. You want to keep producing things that work. And so I would find myself over the course of the day, I'd look at it when I wake up in the morning, then I would look at it over a cup of coffee, then I'd look at it as I was going to the bathroom, and then I would look at it, and it became just in the same sort of way that a cell phone becomes a mechanism of distraction, where when we have cell phones, it becomes so much harder to sustain concentration in the course of a conversation. And you have the impulse, things buzz, you have the impulse, your concentration is constantly being interrupted. The same was true with me with Facebook. And why do I tell you this story? I tell you this story because it's an example of the way in which once you become dependent on the platform, once you become dependent on one of these big technology companies, their values end up becoming your values. And you can't, and you do it without thinking, and despite your best intentions. It's just the gravity. It's the way that things fall in that type of universe. And I'll finish telling the story about the New Republic because it doesn't end happily. But I mean, this is the fundamental thesis of my book, which is that these companies have a view of human nature. They have a view about the way that the world is supposed to operate. And how do I know this? Well, I spent a long time when I was researching my book simply watching YouTube videos of Larry Page, the founder of Google, Mark Zuckerberg, the founder of Facebook. And I would just listen to them talk in town hall meetings or in addresses to programmers or the like. And I was always struck how most media paid attention to the fact that there was a new cell phone that was being released or a new application or new widget that was being released, but they were ignoring the fact that these CEOs were saying profound things about human nature, profound things about their vision of the human species. So to give you an example, Larry Page talks about how human beings are really your code. You're just a pile of algorithms. That's what a human being is. And so if he wants to have you merge with the machine, well, that's just the natural course of human evolution. You're born a cyborg, and so if you become a little bit more cyborg, well, then that is our destiny as a species. And we can see this already happening. Well, first of all, we already outsource a lot of things to our phones, right? We couldn't get to the Senate this morning if we didn't have Google Maps or Waze or something that guides us here, because we've outsourced our sense of direction, which is fine by me. I'm happy to get where I want to go in a more efficient sort of way. Thank you, Google. But we can see that there's a logic to this and that it's headed in a direction. And when we listen to Larry Page, we know that we now wear technology. We wear these companies on our wrist in the form of an Apple Watch. If you were to wear Google Glass, you'd wear it on the bridge of your nose. And Google, the founders of Google, talk about the day in which Google will be implanted in your brain. And in fact, this is just a small digression. One of the big obsessions in Silicon Valley right now is creating telepathic forms of communication. I can't imagine how that could possibly work. I'm not a scientist or an engineer. It sounds like an outlandish fantasy to me, but I thought the idea that you could watch every television show in a device that you carry around in your pocket was an outlandish fantasy too. But Zuckerberg talks about how Facebook wants to be able to read your brain waves so that instead of having to type, it's like a seamless form of communication. Elon Musk is investing very heavily in a company that also I think they call it human-machine interface, that this idea that we can communicate with our machines without having to type, and that they can essentially read our minds. So setting aside whether that's plausible or not, that's a vision that they have. That's the place that they're trying to steer us. Mark Zuckerberg talks about how he has a vision about human integrity. And in his vision of human integrity, we're supposed to be the same person in the Belgian Senate that we are in our private life. That, you know, the person I am in the office is supposed to be the same person I am in the bedroom, and that there should be an integrity. And if I can't have a whole self, if there's not one person that I can present to the world, then I lack integrity. And so he views the idea of sharing to be actually something that makes us better human beings. He's talked about the eradication of secrets and why that's a net good for the world. And so so you can see when you step back and you listen to these guys, you can see that where they're leading us is not some improvised journey, that there's intention behind it. So I'll just flip back a minute to finish telling you the story about the New Republic, because I think it illustrates some of the ways in which it's perilous to become dependent on one of these companies, and why the concentrations of power are extremely problematic. So once upon a time, as I described, the New Republic went from being a magazine that was all about original thought. Then we became a magazine that was all about producing things that were popular. Chris called it snackable content, was something that he felt like we should produce, snackable content. And so there's a whole theory of this in a lot of the new media companies, which is that they talk about producing things for the bored at work crowd. So you're sitting at your laptop at work, you're sitting on a subway platform, you want to veg out, essentially. So you need things that are like it's like a bag of potato chips that you want, that will kind of, you can scoop up and you can consume, and it'll make you feel better. You can decompress, whatever, and then move on. And I don't object to that idea. I mean, we all like entertainment. There's no reason that we shouldn't be able to enjoy those things. But that's what Facebook privileges. That's what Facebook wants you to produce, because that's what Facebook thinks that it's read the data. That's what Facebook views as being the thing that brings it greatest audience. And what it ends up creating is a lot of stuff that looks the same, that sounds the same, that gravitates in a fairly conformist direction. So, an example: a couple years ago, there was a hunter from Minnesota, and he was in Africa, and he posted a picture on Facebook showing him standing on top of the corpse of a lion. Now, he'd killed a lion called Cecil, who was a celebrity lion. He was like the Kim Kardashian of lions or something. And people knew about Cecil. And it was horrible that this guy killed this lion. And people were outraged. And not, incorrectly outraged at this guy. But if you were in media, what you saw was that outrage at the death of that lion was going to make whatever you wrote about it was going to be traffic gold. It would go crazy on Facebook. People would love it. And so at the end of the day, there were 3.2 million stories written about the death of Cecil the lion. And it just points to the way that everybody is chasing, and even the finest publications in the world were writing about Cecil the lion, because even the New York Times, even the New Yorker, even my magazine, The Atlantic, is hugely dependent on Facebook. You sit around all day long thinking about what are the things that will work. on the internet? What are the things that will get more traffic? And it's distorting. And I would argue that Donald Trump was a bit like Cecil the Lion. That when Donald Trump came on the scene, people didn't take him seriously. He was ratings. He was clickbait. He was a cheap way that you could get traffic. That a cheap way to play to people's emotions on both sides. And when you gave this guy attention, it gave him more traction. And there's a real danger to the way in which we have a couple big companies who operate in a very invisible sort of way, shaping the contours of the public square. And it has huge impact on all of us. That I've described Facebook as a feedback loop. It's giving you what you want. And in politics, we see the way in the United States that it's nurtured what's called filter bubbles. And so you have two political tribes. You have one on the left, one on the right, constantly getting information and news that confirms its biases, tells them exactly what they want to hear. It stokes their anxieties. And the danger is not just that we become isolated from one another and that we're hearing news in different ways. It's we become intellectually incapacitated if we're just hearing the things that we want to hear. And so when we're presented with fake news, when we're presented with propaganda or demagoguery, we're not able to make the important distinctions that we need to make. And what I described to you at the New Republic in journalism, those are noble people. Those are good actors who are exploiting people's emotions. But we also know that in the world, they're bad actors. They're people who have bad intentions, who are exploiting the system in precisely the same sort of way. And because it's such a powerful system and because it's so invisible, they can get away with it. Nobody knows. And the Facebook is completely non-transparent about the way that its algorithms work. It's completely non-transparent, even in the face of having screwed up. And so Facebook did a bad job during the election and afterwards it neglected to own up to the fact that it did a bad job. And then when the US Congress came asking it for help in investigating Russian interference in the election, it dragged its heels and declined to give them information. But I think things are starting to turn. At the New Republic, things ended up really badly for me because Chris brought in a CEO from Yahoo to help speed up the course of change. And even though initially I thought, okay, this is not such a terrible, I can live with what he's asking of me so long as we keep getting to produce the type of journalism that we wanted to produce. But the new CEO, he viewed me as kind of an obstacle to change. And so I didn't actually end up meeting with him during his first 2 weeks when he started at the magazine, which was perhaps not a good sign about my future. And there was one day I woke up and somebody called me and they said, hey, there's a guy who's walking around New York who says he's the next editor of the New Republic and he's offering people jobs. And I said, all right, well, I quit then. And so I resigned, and a bunch of other people at the magazine resigned, and it became, in the media in the United States, an example of how Silicon Valley was pushing its way into journalism. But my primary concern is that as citizens, and this is why it's actually, I really appreciate being here in the course of this super democracy experiment, because I think that if we look around the world, I'm sure that this experiment comes from an anxiety that people all around the world have, that democracy right now is just, it's not working. There's a way in which we're failing. The outcomes that we're producing as democracies are not optimal outcomes. we see ourselves drifting in a direction towards where authoritarian impulses have traction that we just simply didn't think was possible in a post-war world. And to me, one of the big problems is that citizens have tremendous responsibility. Citizens have to make very important decisions every couple years about the futures of their countries. And in order to make good decisions about the future of their countries, people need quality information. And without quality information, you get poor quality citizens. And I actually have, if you go back into our histories, not so long ago, we were pretty ambitious in the way that we thought about everyday people. That we thought that people had the capacity to constantly improve themselves. That in order to master a world that's so complicated, we thought that we actually gave citizens a lot of power to master to make decisions in this world because we considered them intellectually capable people, and I feel like we're losing that sense of individual capability. That we're not giving people the information that they need in order to perform their important roles properly. And part of it is that if your attention is always being hijacked by somebody else, if your attention is your cell phone and there's somebody who's trying to grab it all day long, if you're being hooked to these machines. And so I want to make it clear, I think Google is the search engine itself is one of the great achievements of human civilization. It's incredible that you can type anything into a machine and get an answer back straight away. The iPhone is a great achievement of engineering. And I'm not saying that we need to throw these things into the sea and go back to a world of being hunters or gatherers or something. But what I am arguing is that we need to have mastery in our own lives. We need to have a sense of self-control and a sense of being able to shape our own intellectual and political destinies that we don't have right now. And so, and you can see the ways in which these companies are continually encroaching. So right now, the big race in Silicon Valley is to become your personal assistant. So this is Amazon's Alexa, Google Home, Siri. Mark Zuckerberg talks about wanting to create a butler. Wouldn't it be nice to have a butler? And so the idea is that this artificial intelligence will wake you up in the morning and it will guide you through your day. And a lot of this will be amazing. It'll be incredibly efficient. We'll be better organized people probably. You'll get to your appointment on time. But you're also in conversation with a company. And that company wants to use your data in order to help you make decisions. And the problem is human beings have always had tools. We've always had machines, and those tools have been an extension of us. And you could argue that technology is one of the things that defines us as a human species, our capacity to create things that affect and improve our environment. But what happens is that you're not just merging with the machine, you're merging with the company that operates that machine. And I think most people are just not aware of the fact that that's the thing that's happening, and that these companies have power now to shape markets, to shape conversation, and in effect shape democracy, but also to affect how we evolve as a species. And so I think it's just dangerous to have so much power concentrated in the hands of four corporations where there's not a whole lot of pushback. I think about it. as when the automobile was invented. Automobile, great thing, right? It can get you from point A to point B much more efficiently. It transforms economies, makes life a lot better and a lot simpler. But when the car was created, there were no rules. And you know what? There were a lot of crashes. There were a lot of people who got mowed down crossing the street. There were a lot of cars that collided into one another. And so what did human beings do? Well, we made rules. We said that there need to be speed limits and stoplights and seatbelts and fuel efficiency standards. And we took this powerful instrument and we tried to guide it in a way that better served human beings. And I think that we need to do the same thing with these new technologies that we're developing right now. We need to provide an architecture that protects human beings. And so there are several broad things that I think we can do as a society, and I think that there are things that we need to do as individuals. As a society, it is gobsmacking. It's maddening. In the United States, there's no law that protects people's data. Even in Europe, the laws that protect people's data they're the beginning of a conversation. They're not an end point of a conversation. They're the first entree into the subject of protecting people. But I think we need to reshift the paradigm that we have for thinking about data. Companies are able to act right now as if they own data. But what I've described to you is data it's an X-ray of your soul. There's no way that these companies should be allowed to own your data. And I think we need to begin to treat it in the same way that we treat the environment. We let companies exploit the environment. We let them cut down trees. We let them do all sorts of things. But we insist that the environment is not the property of any one company. And so we say, if you're going to exploit the environment, you need to exploit it under certain standards that help protect the rest of us. And so I think we need to shift the way that we protect about data, and we need to be much more aggressive in letting people reclaim their data from these corporations and actually begin to set the rules, as opposed to these all-or-nothing bargains that we get, where you have to click on an oppressive terms of service agreement, and it's either you're kind of able to connect to the world through these instruments, or you have to disappear. It's a terrible bargain for us. I think we need to we have a proud tradition of anti-monopoly laws that are getting really dusty right now. They've been sitting on the shelves. Barack Obama, who I admire in so many ways, didn't break up a single corporation in the course of his presidency. He didn't apply the antitrust laws to try to push back against any company, any firm, any field that had become too concentrated. And that's just the way it goes in the United States, where we've basically given up on the idea of curbing private power. And then, as individuals, we can do so much better. These technologies are addictive. You're part of a grand behavioralist experiment a lot of the time. You're a guinea pig in an experiment where they're constantly testing you to try to find ways to get more and more of your attention, and it's really powerful. But human beings are powerful too. And we've learned, food is a very addictive thing. If I presented you with a bag of potato chips or McDonald's French fries, it's pretty hard to restrain yourself. But as human beings, we teach our children to practice restraint. When it comes to alcohol, most of us are able to practice restraint. And so I think we need to learn moderation as it relates to technology as well. When I was in Silicon Valley, I mentioned I met with this guy called Tristan Harris. I don't know if anybody's heard of Tristan Harris. He had a startup that got bought by Google, and he had a background in both philosophy and computer science. And Google made him their ethicist in chief. And he ended up leaving Google. He was supposed to help design products to be more human. But he ended up leaving Google because he found that the technologies that they were creating were even more addictive than people realized. And he felt like he couldn't change the company from within. So he started an organization called Time Well Spent, which has tips that you can use to try to de-addict yourself from technology. And so I'll just give you a couple of them. He suggests, I don't know, I feel ashamed asking this question in the Senate, but who here sleeps with their cell phone? I don't mean, but people sleep with their cell phones. I sleep with my cell phone, I did before I met Tristan Harris. And his point is that even your phone notifies you in the middle of the night. You wake up, you suddenly grab it. And then the next thing you know, you're in the middle of the night, your circadian rhythms are being interrupted, and you're stuck in the endless scroll. You just go forever looking at Facebook or your email, and even if you put your phone to sleep and it's sitting next to you, you wake up in the middle of the night, and in a fit of insomnia or whatever, you turn to your cell phone because you can't help yourself. And then the next thing you know, you come to work, bleary-eyed and not really equipped to confront the day. He suggests that you turn off the notifications on your phone, that only another human being should have the ability to grab your attention via your technology. He suggests that you remove Facebook from your phone. So if you can use Facebook, but you should use it on your laptop in a way in which you go there with intent. Because what happens so often is that you get into this zombie state where I don't even realize sometimes when I go to an app and I start to get stuck in a system, it just kind of happens. And then an hour goes by and you say, what the hell? What did I just do? And so his point is that rather than drift, rather than say, you take the good, you take the bad, and it's just kind of you have no choice, and if you're going to be a citizen of the world, you just have to go along with this stuff. His point is that you take an active role in shaping your use of these technologies, which is what we need to do. I've been talking way too long, and I'm just going to open it up for questions. I have more things to say, but I'd rather have a conversation at this point. So if people have, if you don't have questions, I've ordered them to lock the doors so I can keep talking to you. So there's no way out. But I'd love to hear what you have to say. Even you young people up there. Yeah.
What I was thinking is, these corporations are international, are global, but which democratic or political level is equipped to get into a bargaining position with them? Nation states, cities, United Nations, European community, they can be circumvented easily enough by these big firms.
Yeah, well, that's a pretty excellent question. And so I think there's what they call a collective action problem. And this is I think something we all face. It's as individuals, we feel the same sort of way. It's like if I disappear from Facebook, well then I'm not part of this platform that everybody else is a part of. So I focus on a couple things that we could all do. First of all, as a global community, we can make these people pay taxes, because it's pretty stunning. It's hard to have sympathy for Walmart, but Walmart pays a 30% effective tax rate. That's state, federal in the United States, and international. Amazon, their primary competitor, pays a 13% effective tax rate. So if Walmart is disadvantaged in that profound sort of way in its competition with Amazon, how's a local bookstore going to compete against Amazon? How is a local clothing boutique going to compete against Amazon when the state when the state is gifting them such a tremendous advantage. I think that in the, I think the Europeans have pointed the way towards interesting solutions, but I also think that these companies are parked in, they're in California, and so it's really incumbent upon the United States to take a lead. I don't know if you followed what London has done to Uber recently, where London basically has threatened to kick Uber out. And Uber, to me, is a lawless company. Uber acts as if, in exactly the way that you're describing, as if no jurisdiction could possibly dictate rules to it. And so the fact that London has taken an aggressive stand against Uber, I think, has terrified Uber, because they worry that the next jurisdiction is going to do the same thing. And so, in the way in which the Europeans have taken a lead, we need politicians, we need states to be the first one out of the gate, because it emboldens others to follow. And also, these companies need a good scare, really. So Mark Zuckerberg exists in a world where Facebook is a cult of personality as a company, and he exists in a world where hardly anyone has asked hard questions of him, which is why I think it's important that the United States Senate forced Mark Zuckerberg to testify about the last election, where he gets asked about fake news, he gets asked about the racist anti-Semitic ads that they sell on their website, he gets asked about Russian interference, because if nobody is applying pressure onto these companies, they'll get away with what they can. Yes.
Maybe linked to that about Mark Zuckerberg, because there was news that he's doing a tour of the United States, and now everybody says he wants to run for president. To your opinion, should we worry even more about that, or does he have already that much power that it wouldn't change?
Right. So, I really hate the possibility that Mark Zuckerberg is the best that Americans could offer as a counter to Donald Trump. I think that I saw a poll, though, yesterday in New Hampshire, which, is the first state to hold a presidential primary. And Mark Zuckerberg was polling at 2% in a Democratic primary. Now, maybe Donald Trump was polling at 2% in New Hampshire a year before, so I won't bank on that. But I think Zuckerberg is probably my guess is that he doesn't have much of a shot at becoming president, because the Democrats are really annoyed at him right now because of the way that Russians were able to exploit the system to help Trump, and they're going to hold it against him. Yes.
Okay, I don't know much about the US, but I think EU, okay, I think I'm pro-European completely. I think we take nice stance with GDPR, for instance, about data protection. Yeah. There are splendid things to be done in this area. In the US, I got the feeling, because I work in technology, the new tech pretty heavily, you have the president you have GAFA. Yeah. Is there like a move from intellectuals in the US that realize what's going on and take some steps on kind of like resistance in order to try to make things change from tech point of view?
Yeah. So I think so. I mean, that's the reason I wrote this book was, and when I started writing my book a couple years ago, people looked at me funny. They said, like, how could you criticize these companies because they're so great, they have so much prestige. But last week I was on the radio, and a radio show host accused me of saying the conventional wisdom about GAFA. And so I think things are changing. The election changed a lot in the way that people think about these companies. It starts with Facebook, but I think it trickles down. The Democratic Party. So we're in a populist moment, right? Everybody around the world is angry, and Democrats are looking for a way to take that anger and shift it in a direction that's more socially, economically useful. And so for the first time in decades, in generations, Democrats are talking about the problem of monopoly. Now, Democrats are scared to take on the technology companies because the technology companies give a lot of money to the Democratic Party. Eric Schmidt, who was the chairman of Google, was basically embedded in the Barack Obama campaign and the Hillary Clinton campaign, and he gave them data to help their campaigns. He helped them hire data analysts, and he created his own startup that was hired almost exclusively by the Democratic campaigns. And it was pretty smart politics, right? So where's your enemy going to come from if you're these companies? Well, it's probably going to come from the left sooner than it's going to come from the right. And so they convinced the left and the Democratic Party that they were friends, that they agreed on issues like immigration and trade and other things, and so they could work together. And so it's going to be hard to pull it apart. But one of the interesting things is that the question is going to pull apart the left, and it's also going to pull apart the right, because you have there's a tradition. I've been on Fox News, and I've been on right-wing talk radio to discuss my book, and I found that they're actually really receptive to my arguments. And so maybe it's actually one of these issues that ironically can produce some common ground in a place where it's hard to find much common ground. Yes.
I have an easy question with a difficult answer, I think. I just wondered, you were at some point giving some inspiration to take home, and maybe that's nice to continue. If we take your parallel with snacks, then snacks will always remain. We will always like snacks, but we can at least be more motivated to also eat healthy. And do you see a similar shift here? And what are the alternatives? Is it only that we all need to be more awake, or should we also, for instance, use different services and not centralize all our data with Google and all our data with Facebook? So not use WhatsApp, but use something else like Signal or whatever. What else would you send us home with?
So I think what you're saying is something that I agree with, which is that if you look at the example of food, that food is actually a hopeful example, because so childhood obesity is a plague. It's afflicting large parts of the planet, and it's actually getting worse right now. But you do have at least some consciousness that's developed on the part of governments, elites, media, about a better way to eat. And so I look at farmers markets, which proliferate. Are farmers markets much more? Europeans have always had farmers markets, but in the United States, there's been a big move to farmers markets, and that actually is an inspiring example, because you have people who are making a decision to pay more, to be less efficient, in order to achieve more virtuous results. And so I think we can do the same thing when it comes to, at least with media, where people need to think about media in a more virtuous sort of way, that we all need to become benefactors. We all need to, it's not enough to just say that it's there for free. I think we have to make choices. So George Orwell once wrote, for instance, an essay called Books versus Cigarettes. And so he went into his library and he tried to figure out how much he'd spent on all the volumes on his bookshelves. And then he figured out how much money he'd spent on cigarettes, and he tried to do the same calculation for the average Brits. And they spent so much money on cigarettes and dog races and all these other things. And books, it turned out, are actually a very, very minor expense. We convince ourselves that we don't have the money to spend on a newspaper or on a book, but really we spend money in so many other sort of ways. We're just not making a choice. We're not forcing ourselves into a decision. Just on the subject of books, I mean, one thing that makes me actually extremely optimistic is when the Kindle was invented in 2008, everybody said that the paper book was going to die. And Nicholas Negroponte, who is the head of the MIT Media Lab, said in the year 2015, there will no longer be paper books published. And so we're now in 2017, and ebook sales have plateaued. And in the last couple of years, paper book sales have ticked up 2 or 3% each year. And so what's happened? Why have we defied these predictions of doom? What happened? And I can only talk about what happened in my own life, which is when I bought a Kindle, I found myself I was so excited. You know, how I love books. How amazing that I can have the entire library of humanity in my jacket pocket. And whenever I want a new book, I don't even have to go to a bookstore. I can just get it straight away. And there are no more annoying, messy piles of books in my house. How exciting is that? Well, I think I had a Kindle for a couple years, and eventually I found myself just gravitating back towards paper. And I live on screens all day long. You know, I like Twitter. Twitter is great. It captures a lot of, maybe too much of my attention. But I think that subconsciously, I crave an escape from the screen. There are moments in the day where I don't want to be umbilically connected to a company store. I don't want somebody watching over me as I read. And in fact, the whole history of reading is, up until very recently, was a trajectory where we were moving from reading used to be something that was done in public, that it was a magical thing. You had priests standing at lecterns reading the Word of God to audiences that were incapable of reading themselves. And reading took place in markets, and it took place in public spaces. And then suddenly you had the printing press, and you had changes in the rules of grammar, and so reading became less esoteric, required less skill, became more central to commerce, and suddenly literacy expanded. And once literacy expanded, reading stopped happening in public, and increasingly it happened in private. And it transformed humanity, because when individuals were allowed to interact with text themselves, they were able to think more as individuals. They were able to, when we read, when I'm reading a book, I don't exactly know what happens to my brain and in the ways in which my brain kind of becomes more mentally awakened in that deep engagement with text, which is so different than reading on the internet. When you read on the internet, it's grazing. You're looking for information in a way that is very utilitarian. I find it hard to get lost in text on the internet. I get lost all the time in the internet, where I start off doing one thing and then I end up getting on some website that I had no idea why I was doing, and I forgot what I was doing in the first place. But this history of reading, this move towards privacy, it made us, once we were able to interact with text ourselves, actually there was this explosion of new ideas. People became less cautious, more subversive, people were able to develop. It was of a piece with the development of a whole private self, a whole private way of thinking. And it's still true. people like to read in their most private. If you read a book, you read it in the most private places. You read it in bed. You read it in the bathtub. You read it in a chair, and it's not like the internet. Nobody's watching over your shoulder, at least not yet. Nobody is watching to see how you're reading it. You're not connected to a story. You're not being notified constantly. A book doesn't buzz. A book doesn't tell you that you have a new email. And so I think there's something innately human that wants to preserve private space, that wants to preserve contemplation, that wants to preserve independent thought. And we need to work with that instinct, and we need to create an architecture. We need to teach our children. We need to create economic structures that allow us to keep that important thing. Because, like I said, with technology, we just kind of go with the flow too much. But if we go with the flow, it's possible we'll surrender things that we actually care about. And so, before that happens, let's be intentional, and let's try to figure out what type of species we want to become. And I think we need to fight for that vision. I think, all right, one more, then we'll wrap it up. I think you need to turn that on. I don't know much about technology, but I think you need to turn that on.
How do I do that? Like that?
How do you turn it off is the better question.
In the beginning, in the opening of your book, you write about the Whole Earth Catalog by Stuart Brand, which is a really important book for these tech companies. What do you hope to reach with your book? Could it be a Whole Earth Catalog as well for waking up?
That's very flattering in that comparison, because the book that he's describing was kind of it was a guidebook for basically the late 60s, in a way in which people could use technology to try to accomplish what the communes of the 60s and the hippies and the counterculture failed to produce. And I wrote the book as kind of a statement of conscience, and it was more just to be consistent with what I was saying before. I wrote a book that was a critique of companies, but I think in our society we tend to misunderstand criticism, that we tend to think that, oh, you're just trying to tear something down, or oh, you hate these people because of X, Y, and Z reason. But no, I don't have a problem with technology. I don't have a problem with capitalism. I don't have a problem with these. But what I do, it's not like my book is a critique, but more than a critique, I tried to write it as a defense of the things that I think are important and that I care about. And I think that just as a society, we need to better understand we need to be more open to criticism, because criticism isn't a negative activity. It can actually be an act of great affirmation. All right. It's been a huge pleasure speaking to you all. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, you hear me, Mr. Foer, for your lecture. I think indeed it's time to wrap up, because we're getting slowly addicted to you. And thank you for sharing your thoughts on your book, On the World Without Mind, which is very fascinating, because we are at the crossroads of law, economics, political science, social science. It's really fascinating crossroads you're at. But I will certainly recall the optimistic note that you also mentioned. So maybe there is food for a new book called The Return of the Mind. So Thank you, and I hope everyone who is able to come tomorrow. We have another lecture at 13 o'clock, I think, 13. Julia Cagé is going to talk about democracy and media, another threat or opportunity for democracy. Thank you.
Thank you so much.